The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital buzzed faintly overhead as Carolyn McLean leaned against the nurse's station, scribbling her final notes of the shift. Her handwriting, usually crisp and precise, had devolved into a tired scrawl, a testament to the 12 hours she'd just endured. At 30, she was no stranger to the grind of night shifts, but tonight had been relentless. A cardiac arrest in room 204, a combative patient in the ER, and an endless stream of charts to update. Her dark hair clung to her forehead in damp strands, and her green eyes, normally bright with focus, were shadowed with exhaustion. "See you tomorrow, Care," said Jen, one of the other RNs, slinging her bag over her shoulder as she headed for the exit. "Try to actually sleep this time." Carolyn managed a faint smile. "No promises." The clock above the desk read 7:14 a.m. as she signed out, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. The cool March air hit her as she stepped outside, a welcome relief after the stale warmth of the hospital. She tugged her jacket tighter around her, the promise of her bed pulling her like a magnet toward her car. It was only a 15-minute drive to her apartment, and all she could think about was the hot shower waiting for her, the soft flannel sheets she'd crawl into, and the blissful silence of a day off. The drive passed in a blur, the streets of her small town still quiet in the early morning light. When she finally unlocked her apartment door, she kicked off her shoes with a groan, letting her bag slump to the floor. The shower was quick but scalding, steam curling around her as the tension in her shoulders began to loosen. Wrapped in a towel, she padded to her bedroom, the faint scent of lavender from her diffuser already lulling her towards sleep. She slipped into an oversized t-shirt, pulled back the covers, and sank into the mattress with a sigh. Her eyes fluttered shut, the world fading away. The shrill ring of her phone jolted her awake. Carolyn fumbled for it on the nightstand, squinting at the screen. The name Linda glowed in the dim light, and her stomach tightened. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice thick with sleep. "Linda? What's going on?" "Carolyn, I'm sorry to wake you." Linda's voice rasped through the line, unsteady and faint. "I'm not feeling well. My chest's tight, and I'm a little dizzy." Carolyn sat up, instantly alert, her nurse's instincts kicking in. "Have you called 911? No, it's not that bad," Linda said quickly. "I just need one of my pills. The hydralazine, it'll bring my blood pressure down. I'll be fine." Carolyn's grip tightened on the phone. She knew Linda's history: hypertension, stubbornness, and a tendency to downplay symptoms until it was almost too late. "Linda, you don't mess around with chest tightness. Where's the bottle? Do you have it with you?" "It's in the kitchen," Linda said, her breath catching slightly. "I just need to get up and—" "No!" Carolyn cut in, already swinging her legs out of bed. "Stay where you are. I'm coming over. And if you feel worse before I get there, you call 911, okay? Promise me." There was a pause, then a reluctant, "Okay." Carolyn hung up, her heart pounding as she yanked on jeans and a hoodie. Sleep was a distant memory now, replaced by a familiar surge of adrenaline. She grabbed her keys and bolted out the door, the cold morning air biting at her still damp hair. Linda lived 20 minutes away, 15 if she pushed it. As she slid into her car and the engine roared to life, one thought looped through her mind: please let her be okay. When she screeched into the driveway, gravel crunching under her tires, the porch light glowed like a beacon against the grey dawn. Linda's little brick house looked the same as ever. Flower boxes brimming with pansies, the faded welcome mat Carolyn had bought her years ago. She fumbled with the spare key under the mat, her fingers shaky from adrenaline, and burst inside. "Linda, where are you?" "Over here, Hon." Linda's voice drifted from the living room, thin but steady. Carolyn hurried in and found Linda sunk into the couch, a knit blanket bunched around her lap. Her grey hair was a wild halo, and her hands fidgeted with the blanket's frayed edge. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a scent Carolyn knew as well as her own home. She scanned the space, expecting to see David sprawled in the recliner or hear his low grumble from the kitchen. Nothing. No boots by the door, no empty beer cans on the coffee table. Her jaw tightened. Out having fun again, I bet, she thought, the old sting of resentment flaring up before she shoved it aside. "Let me take a look at you," Carolyn said, dropping to her knees beside the couch. She grabbed Linda's wrist, her fingers finding the pulse, steady if a little fast, and reached for the blood pressure cuff on the coffee table. Linda's lifeline, always within arm's reach. The machine hummed as it tightened, then beeped. 142/88. Carolyn frowned, tilting her head. "It's up, but not enough for hydralazine. How's your chest feeling now?" Linda shifted, her eyes flicking to the floor. "Better, I think. Not so tight anymore." Carolyn sat back on her heels, watching her closely. The hesitation in Linda's voice, the way she wouldn't quite meet her gaze. It clicked. "You didn't really need the pill, did you?" she asked, her tone softening. Linda's lips twitched into a sheepish smile, her hands stalling on the blanket. "Caught me, huh?" "No, I guess I didn't. I couldn't stand the quiet tonight. David's off gallivanting somewhere and the house felt like it was swallowing me whole. I knew you'd come running." Carolyn let out a long breath, half laugh, half sigh, and rubbed a hand over her face. "Linda, you nearly gave me a heart attack. You could have just said, 'Hey, I'm lonely. Come keep me company.'" I'd have grumbled less. I know," Linda said, reaching out to pat Carolyn's hand. Her fingers were cool and bony, but the touch was warm in its own way. "I didn't mean to scare you, sweetheart. I'm an old fool sometimes." "Sometimes?" Carolyn teased, a tired grin tugging at her mouth. She kicked off her sneakers and climbed onto the couch, pulling her legs up under her. "Scoot over. I'm too wiped to drive back now anyway." Linda chuckled, shifting to make room, and tossed half the blanket over Carolyn's lap. "You're a saint, you know that? Putting up with me after all these years." "Saint's a stretch," Carolyn said, leaning her head back against the cushions. "I just don't know how to say no to you." They settled into an easy quiet, the kind that didn't need filling right away. The wall clock ticked steadily, its rhythm blending with the faint creak of the house. Then Linda's voice broke through, soft and nostalgic. "You remember that time you and David tried to make me lasagna? Lord, I can still smell that burnt cheese." Carolyn snorted, the memory bubbling up clear as day. "Oh God, yes, he swore he could handle the oven, and I was dumb enough to trust him. We spent an hour scraping that pan and you still ate it." "Had to," Linda said, her eyes crinkling. "You two looked so proud of that mess, back when you were still a team." "Yeah," Carolyn murmured, her gaze drifting to the mantel. A faded photo sat there, her and David on their wedding day, Linda beaming between them, all teeth and pride. "Back when?" Linda nudged her gently. "Tell me about that camping trip again, the one where he fell in the lake chasing that fish." Carolyn laughed, the sound loosening the ache in her chest. "He was so mad, flailing around in the water, yelling about how that bass owed him a new shirt. You just sat there with your coffee saying, 'That's what you get for showing off.'" "I was right, wasn't I?" Linda grinned, and for a while they traded stories like that, small, bright pieces of a life that used to fit together. Carolyn's eyelids grew heavy, the exhaustion seeping back in, but she stayed, tucked under the blanket with Linda's voice weaving through the stillness. The past felt softer tonight, less jagged around the edges, and she let it carry her along. Carolyn's life had unraveled the day she walked into her own home and found David tangled up with some girl barely out of her teens. The sight hit her like a punch to the gut, his sheepish grin, her lipstick smeared on his collar, the half-empty wine bottle on the counter. She'd stood there, frozen. If only she hadn't had her shift cancelled that day. She'd thrown him out that night, her voice raw from screaming, her hands trembling as she shoved his clothes into a duffel bag. It was a blow she'd never seen coming, but it was Linda who'd taken it harder. Linda had sobbed for days when Carolyn broke the news, her frail frame shaking as she clutched a tissue in her kitchen. My boy. How could he? She'd whispered, over and over, her voice cracking like brittle glass. At 72, Linda's heart was already fragile. Hypertension. A mild stroke a few years back, and Carolyn could see the betrayal carving new lines into her weathered face. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the shattering of a family Linda had poured her soul into. Carolyn had knelt beside her that day, gripping her hands, and promised, "I'm not going anywhere, Linda. I'll be here whenever you need me." It was a vow she meant to keep, no matter what David thought. But David had other ideas. After the split, he'd turned territorial, hovering over Linda like a guard dog. He wouldn't let Carolyn near the house when he was around, his jaw tight and his eyes cold every time she showed up. "You don't belong here anymore," he'd snapped once, blocking the doorway while Linda peered out from behind him, silent and torn. Carolyn figured he was scared she'd poison Linda against him, fill her head with the ugly details he'd rather keep buried. Or maybe it was something else, something guiltier, gnawing at him. Whatever it was, it forced their visits into the shadows. Linda's late-night calls became routine, always when David was out, probably at some bar or chasing another fling. Carolyn never asked. She just answered. That morning, after hours of reminiscing on Linda's couch, Carolyn glanced at the clock. 11:47 a.m. The stories had tapered off, and the weight of the night shift was dragging at her bones. She stretched, her back popping, and said, "I should head out. Don't want to push my luck if David swings by." Linda's face crumpled, her watery blue eyes brimming as she reached for Carolyn's hand. "Do you have to? It's so good having you here, hon. I hate this. Hate him making it so hard." Carolyn squeezed her hand, her throat tight. "I know. I hate it too. But I'll be back soon, okay? Next time he's out, you call me. Day or night." Linda nodded, sniffling as she pulled Carolyn into a hug. Her arms were thin but fierce, and Carolyn could feel the tremble in them. "You're too good to me," Linda murmured into her shoulder. "Always have been." "Someone's got to keep you out of trouble," Carolyn said with a small, sad smile, brushing a strand of grey hair from Linda's cheek. She grabbed her sneakers, slipped them on, and stepped onto the porch, the midday sun harsh after the dim living room. Linda stood in the doorway waving a shaky goodbye, tears streaking her cheeks again. It was the same every time, and it never got easier. The drive home felt longer than usual, the hum of the engine barely cutting through the fog in Carolyn's head. She pulled into her apartment complex, climbed the stairs and let herself in, the silence of the place wrapping around her like a heavy coat. She dropped her keys on the counter with a clatter and sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. A sigh escaped her, long and weary. She didn't know it yet, but that morning, Linda's tear-streaked face framed in the doorway would be the last time she'd see her alive. The phone rang just as Carolyn was pouring her second cup of coffee, the bitter aroma still curling through her tiny kitchen. She glanced at the screen, Jen from the hospital, and answered with a casual, "Hey, what's up?" But Jen's voice was tight, hesitant, not her usual chipper tone. "Carolyn, I don't know how to say this. Linda's gone. They found her this morning. Heart attack, they think." The words slammed into Carolyn like a rogue wave, knocking the breath from her lungs. The mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the tile floor, coffee splattering across her bare feet. She staggered back, one hand clutching her chest as if she could hold her heart together. "No," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "No, that can't. She was fine yesterday." A heart attack? It didn't make sense. Not yet. She sank onto a kitchen chair, the cold wood pressing against her thighs, and stared at the mess on the floor. They weren't bound by blood, she and Linda, no shared DNA to tie them together. But that had never mattered. From the day Carolyn had married David, Linda had folded her into her life like a daughter, her quiet warmth a steady anchor through every storm. When Carolyn's own parents faded into distance, too busy, too far, Linda had stepped in, unwavering. And when David's betrayal tore everything apart, it was Linda who'd held Carolyn's hand, who'd seen her through the wreckage. Linda had always had a way of seeing her, really seeing her when no one else bothered. David had missed it, too wrapped up in himself to notice the way Carolyn's kindness softened the edges of a hard day, or how her strength carried her through sleepless shifts and his own chaos. But Linda, she'd caught it all. "You've got a heart bigger than most, hun," she'd say, her voice gentle as she stirred a pot of soup or patched up a torn quilt. "Don't let my fool of a son make you forget that." And Carolyn hadn't, because Linda wouldn't let her. Now, with the phone still pressed to her ear, Jen's voice faded into a dull hum. Carolyn's chest ached, a hollow space opening up where Linda's laugh used to live. She'd been there just yesterday, trading stories under that worn blanket, promising to come back. How could that be the end? The news of Linda's death had barely settled into Carolyn's bones when the mail arrived, a crisp white envelope slicing through her grief like a paper cut. She tore it open expecting a funeral notice, but instead found an embossed card, an official invitation to the reading of Linda's will. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected this, hadn't dared to think Linda would include her in something so formal. They'd been family in every way that mattered, but on paper? She was just the ex-daughter-in-law. The invitation trembled in her hands, a fragile thread of connection to the woman she'd lost. The day of the reading dawned grey and dreary, rain streaking the windows of her apartment like tears she couldn't shed anymore. Carolyn stood before her mirror, smoothing the stiff fabric of a black dress she'd dug out of the closet. It was plain, severe, the kind of thing you wore to mourn properly, but it did little to steady the anxious tremor in her fingers. She pulled her dark hair into a tight bun, her reflection pale and hollow-eyed, and grabbed her coat. The drive to the law office was a blur of windshield wipers and muted radio static, her mood sinking into the damp, heavy air. She parked outside the squat brick building, its sign reading Harrington and Sons in faded gold letters. Rain pattered against her umbrella as she stepped out, her heels clicking on the wet pavement. She took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. Then her eyes lifted to the porch, and the world tilted. David stood there, his broad shoulders slouched under a leather jacket, cigarette smoke curling from his lips. But he wasn't alone. Beside him was Shirley, young, brash Shirley, her blonde hair teased high, her lips painted a bold red that matched her tight dress. She smirked, one hip cocked, and in her arms was a bundle wrapped in a pale blue blanket. A tiny hand poked out, followed by a soft coo. Their child. Carolyn's stomach lurched, bile clawing up her throat. She'd known, suspected for months, piecing it together from Linda's vague hints. But knowing was one thing. Seeing it right there, raw and undeniable, was a dagger twisting in her chest. Shirley's eyes flicked to Carolyn, cold and unyielding, not even bothering with a victor's grin, just pure cutting arrogance. David had once called Carolyn weak, a pushover too soft for the jagged edges of his world. Shirley, though, she was his match. Sharp, fearless, the kind of woman who'd claw her way to whatever she wanted, consequences be damned. And now here she was, cradling proof of what Carolyn couldn't give him, what he'd thrown their life away for. Her legs wobbled, the urge to bolt screaming through her. She could turn around, vanish into the rain, leave this nightmare behind and never face them again. But something fiercer, pride maybe, or the stubborn streak Linda had always admired, rooted her in place. She wouldn't let them see her break, not today. Swallowing the nausea, Carolyn forced her feet forward, climbing the slick steps one slow, deliberate stride at a time. David exhaled a plume of smoke, his gaze sliding over her with a flicker of mockery. Shirley shifted the baby, her smirk deepening, but neither said a word. They parted just enough to let her pass, their silence louder than any taunt. Inside, the law office smelled of polished wood and aging paper, the receptionist's desk flanked by shelves of leather-bound books. A balding man in a grey suit, the lawyer, she assumed, looked up from his clipboard and nodded curtly. "Ms. McLean? This way, please." He gestured to a small conference room, its long table flanked by stiff chairs. Carolyn sank into one, her hands clasped tight in her lap to hide the shaking. David and Shirley sauntered in after her, settling across the table like they owned the place. The baby fussed briefly, a tiny whimper slicing through the silence, and Shirley shushed it with a practiced sway. The air crackled with tension, thick and suffocating. The lawyer shuffled papers at the head of the table, oblivious or indifferent to the storm brewing between them. Carolyn kept her eyes on the wall clock, its steady ticking a lifeline, anything to avoid the weight of David's stare or Shirley's smug presence. The room pressed in, the faint creak of the building and the drumming rain outside amplifying the ache in her chest. The room's oppressive silence finally broke when the lawyer, Soren Hill, cleared his throat with a dry rasp. He adjusted his tie, a muted grey that matched his thinning hair, and peered over his wire-rimmed glasses at the trio before him. "So," he began, his voice steady and clipped, "we are gathered here for the reading of the will of the late Linda Baxter. Present are all interested parties. Her son, David Baxter, his—" He faltered, his gaze darting to Shirley, who sat with her chin tilted defiantly, the baby now dozing in her arms. "Companion," Soren settled on, a faint frown creasing his brow, "and Carolyn McLean." Carolyn flinched at the sound of her maiden name, a sharp reminder of the life she'd tried to reclaim. Legally, she was still Carolyn Baxter, David's wife on paper, bound by a marriage certificate that felt like a relic from another lifetime. But that bond had shattered the moment she'd caught him with Shirley, their laughter spilling out of their bedroom like poison. She shifted in her seat, the black dress pulling tight across her shoulders, and forced her eyes to stay on Soren. He opened a thick manila folder with deliberate care, the rustle of paper loud in the tense air. Extracting a few crisp sheets, he studied them intently, his fingers tracing the edges as if to ground himself. Then he adjusted his glasses, the lenses catching the dim light of the overhead lamp, and glanced up again. "Before we proceed with the reading, I should note there's a letter from Linda attached to the will. It'll be read afterward." His tone was matter-of-fact, but the mention of a letter sent a ripple of curiosity through Carolyn's numb haze. She nodded faintly, her hands twisting together in her lap. Soren cleared his throat again, a habit it seemed, and began. His voice droned flat and emotionless, but each word landed on Carolyn like a stone. "I, Linda Baxter, being of sound mind and memory, hereby bequeath all my movable and immovable property." He listed the assets with mechanical precision. An apartment in the heart of the city, its bay windows overlooking the bustling square, a country house with peeling paint, and a sagging porch swing. Bank accounts plump with decades of careful savings, a modest portfolio of stocks. Carolyn listened through a fog, the details swirling around her like a dream she couldn't grasp. She'd expected nothing, maybe a keepsake, a trinket to remember Linda by. Not this. Soren's voice pressed on, unrelenting. "All the above-listed property I bequeath to Carolyn McLean." The room froze. The words hung there, heavy and surreal, and Carolyn's breath snagged in her chest. "All of it? To me?" Her mind reeled, disbelief crashing over her like a cold wave. Across the table, David's head snapped up, his jaw slackening as he exchanged a wild, incredulous look with Shirley. Her smug mask slipped, replaced by a flash of shock, her painted nails digging into the baby's blanket. "What the hell?" David started, his voice rough, but Soren held up a hand, cutting him off without a glance. "There's more," the lawyer said, his tone unchanged. "In the event that Carolyn McLean refuses the inheritance, it will go to a charitable foundation for children suffering from cancer." He set the papers down, folding his hands atop them, and finally looked up, his expression unreadable. Carolyn blinked, the fog lifting as the weight of it settled in. She felt David's stare boring into her, hot and furious, and Shirley's sharp intake of breath beside him. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder now, each second stretching into eternity. Linda had done this, chosen her, not her own son. The realization was a lifeline and a burden all at once, pulling her out of her stupor. She straightened in her chair, her trembling hands stilling as she met Soren's gaze. The silence shattered as David erupted, his chair scraping back with a harsh screech against the hardwood floor. "This is a mistake," he bellowed, leaping to his feet, his face flushed a mottled red. "No way! This can't be right! My mother wouldn't do this to me!" His voice cracked with a mix of fury and disbelief, his hands slamming down on the table, rattling the stack of papers in front of Soren. The baby stirred in Shirley's arms, letting out a small, startled cry, but David didn't seem to notice. Shirley was up in an instant, mirroring him, her heels clicking sharply as she shot to her feet. "Yeah, this is bullshit," she screeched, her voice shrill and piercing, cutting through the room like a blade. "It's a forgery, some kind of scam. This guy's a fraud, probably in on it with her." She jabbed a manicured finger toward Carolyn, her eyes blazing with venom, the baby now squirming against her chest. Her blonde curls bounced wildly as she gestured, her composure unraveling into something raw and desperate. Soren didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly in his chair, peering at them over the rims of his glasses, his expression as calm as a still pond. The faintest hint of a sigh escaped him before he spoke, his voice even and measured, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding. "I understand your surprise," he said, folding his hands atop the will as if to anchor it against their outrage. "But I assure you, this document was drawn up in full accordance with legal requirements, signed, witnessed, and notarized. You're welcome to contest it in court if you wish." He paused, letting the words settle, then added with a quiet firmness, "Though I must warn you, the chances of overturning it are slim to none." Linda was meticulous about this. David's fists tightened until his knuckles blanched white, the veins in his forearms bulging under the strain. He stood there, chest heaving, staring at the table as if he could will the will to rewrite itself. His mother, had stripped him bare, left him nothing. He'd been so damn sure it had all come to him, the only son, the rightful heir. The apartment, the country house, all of it was supposed to be his. And Carolyn? That quiet, mousy little nobody. She'd get a pity prize at best, maybe a photo album or some old jewellery, scraps to toss her way while he took the lion's share. He wheeled on her, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to ignite the air between them. "You must have told her something," he roared, his voice booming off the wood-panelled walls. "What did you do, huh? Whisper in her ear? Turn her against me? You sneaky little—" He cut himself off, teeth grinding, as if the words he wanted to hurl were too vile even for this moment. Carolyn flinched, her shoulders hunching as his shout slammed into her. She felt the sting of it in her chest, a sharp, jagged thing that made her breath catch. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair, the rough fabric biting into her palms. She didn't get it. Why he hated her this much, why his rage always seemed to find her as its target. What had she ever done to him but love him once, trust him until he'd shattered it? Her lips parted, but no words came, just a quiet, bewildered, "You." David didn't hear her, or didn't care. He was a freight train now, unstoppable, barreling through the wreckage of his pride, his face twisted, red and blotchy, humiliation burning in his eyes. "You think you're so innocent, sitting there all quiet like you didn't scheme your way into this?" he spat, pacing a tight circle beside the table, his boots thudding against the floor. Soren's hand shot up, palm out, cutting through the storm of David's tirade, like a referee calling a time-out. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm but steady, carrying the weight of authority. "I ask you to maintain order. Or I'll have no choice but to call the police and have this room cleared. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a letter from Linda attached to the will." He paused, his eyes sweeping over them. David's heaving rage, Shirley's coiled tension, Carolyn's quiet shock. "I think you'll want to hear it." He reached into the folder with a slow, deliberate motion, pulling out a single sheet of paper, its edges slightly creased as if it had been held and folded often. Adjusting his glasses, he began to read, and his monotone gave way to something softer, a thread of sadness weaving through his words. The room seemed to hush, even the rain outside fading to a distant murmur. "My dear Carolyn," he began, his voice dipping as if stepping into Linda's presence. "If you're hearing this letter, it means I've already left this world. I want to thank you for everything you did for me. You weren't just a daughter-in-law. You were a daughter in every way that matters. You cared for me when I was frail, sat with me through my lonely nights, loved me when I felt forgotten. I know David never saw your worth, that he's caused you more pain than you deserved, but I see you, Carolyn. I believe in you. You're stronger and wiser than he'll ever know, and you deserve happiness. I want you to find it, to build a life that's yours." Soren's voice faltered, a faint tremor breaking through his composure. He cleared his throat, a rough sound in the stillness, and pressed on. "David, my son, I'm so very disappointed in you. I know about your affair with Shirley. I know you're expecting a child with her soon. I don't judge you for it. God knows I've made my own mistakes, but it breaks my heart to see how you've betrayed Carolyn. She was a faithful wife, loyal and true. She loved you with every piece of her heart, and you repaid her with deceit, humiliation, betrayal. I can't leave you my property, not when I know you'd fritter it away on fleeting things. I want it to go to Carolyn, to give her a fresh start, a chance to be happy in a way you never allowed. Goodbye, my son. I hope one day you'll see the weight of what you've done and make it right." Carolyn's tears came unbidden, tracing warm paths down her cheeks. Each word felt like a thread stitching her heart back together, only to unravel it again with the ache of Linda's absence. She pressed her lips together, swallowing a sob, her hands trembling in her lap as the depth of Linda's love washed over her. Across the table, David sat rigid, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. He'd always been the golden boy in his own mind, his mother's favourite, the one she'd dote on no matter how far he strayed. He'd convinced himself she'd forgive anything, turn a blind eye to his flaws like she always had. But this was a judgment he hadn't seen coming, and it left him reeling, his certainty crumbling like ash. Soren cleared his throat, the sound jarring in the stillness. "So," he said, his voice returning to its brisk professional cadence, "the will of Linda Baxter has been read. If there are no questions, you're free to go." He stacked the papers neatly, his movements precise, as if signalling the end of a chapter. Shirley's face twisted with scorn as the reality sank in. She shoved David aside with a sharp elbow, the baby jostling in her arms. "You're a pathetic loser," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom as she leaned close, her breath hot against his face. "I don't need a man like you dragging me down." Without waiting for a reply, she spun around, her heels clacking furiously against the floor, and stormed out of the room, the baby's soft whimpers trailing behind her. Carolyn watched it unfold from her chair, a strange detachment settling over her like a fog. She felt a pang of pity for him, seeing him abandoned by the woman who'd sworn loyalty just to bleed him dry. But it mingled with contempt, sharp and bitter, and the old resentment that still simmered beneath her skin. David blinked, as if waking from a trance, and turned to her. His eyes were red-rimmed, glistening with tears that spilled over as he stumbled forward. "Carolyn, forgive me," he whispered, his voice breaking as he grabbed her hand, his grip clammy and desperate. "I was an idiot, a complete fool. I messed up so bad. Please give me a chance to fix this." His words trembled, raw with a regret she'd never heard from him before. Carolyn yanked her hand free, the warmth of his touch replaced by a chill that matched her gaze. She stood, towering over him as he faltered, and met his eyes with a steely resolve. "Fix this, David." Her voice was steady, cutting through his plea like a blade. "What? Turn back time? Erase the nights you spent with her, the child you made. Pretend you didn't rip my heart out and stomp on it. No, that's not possible." He crumpled, dropping to his knees with a thud that echoed in the quiet room, his hands clutching at the air where hers had been. "Please, Carolyn," he begged, his voice hoarse, tears streaking his face. "I know I don't deserve it, I know that, but I've got nothing left, nowhere to go. Please help me. Share some of the inheritance. I'm begging you." His shoulders shook, his pride stripped away, leaving only a man broken by his own making. "David," she said at last, her voice firm, unyielding as stone, "I get that you're hurting right now, that everything's falling apart. But I'm not your safety net. You chose this road, every step of it. You tore your own life to pieces, and I'm not here to pick them up for you." He lifted his head, his tear-filled eyes pleading. "But we were a family, Carolyn. We had years together. Good years. Can't you find it in you to forgive me, just a little?" She shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "Forgive? Maybe, in time. But forget? Never. And I'm not going back to what was. You didn't just betray me, David. You betrayed yourself, our love, everything we built. So please let me go. I'm starting over, and I need to do it alone." With that, she turned, her footsteps steady as she walked out of the room, the faint creak of the door the only sound behind her. She didn't look back, not at the man on his knees, not at the wreckage he'd made. David stayed there, crumpled amidst the shards of his shattered dreams, the weight of his loss pressing him into the floor. Carolyn had loved David once with a fierceness that had lit up her world. He'd been her anchor, her laughter, her late-night talks over cheap wine and takeout. But that love had withered, choked out by his betrayal, until it was little more than a ghost haunting her memories. Linda had been the last tether to that past, the one person who'd held a piece of the man David used to be, the man Carolyn had believed in. Now, with Linda gone, that thread was severed, and the weight of it left her both hollow and free. She wouldn't cling to shadows anymore. It was time to start over, to build something new from the ashes. Packing didn't take long. She moved through her apartment with quiet efficiency, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. She pulled a single suitcase from the closet, its zipper rasping as she opened it and filled it with the bare essentials. A few changes of clothes, her favourite mug with the chipped handle, a worn paperback Linda had given her years ago. The rest, the framed photos of happier days, the sweater David had left behind, the little trinkets from a life that no longer fit, she left, untouched. They sat like relics on the shelves, gathering dust, relics of a past she was ready to shed. By the time she zipped the suitcase shut, the room felt lighter, emptier, and so did she. The next morning, the sun peeked through a haze of clouds, casting pale light across her kitchen table. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over Soren Hill's number before she pressed it. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp but warm. "Ms. McLean, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" "I'd like to meet," she said, her tone steady despite the flutter in her chest. "There's something I need to discuss. About the inheritance." "Of course," he replied, a hint of curiosity creeping in. "I'm free this afternoon. Say, 2 o'clock at the office?" "Perfect. See you then." She hung up, her resolve hardening as she grabbed her coat and keys. The clock on Soren Hill's office wall ticked past 2 when Carolyn stepped inside, the faint hum of a heater buzzing in the background. She shed her coat, draping it over the back of a chair, and sat across from him, the familiar conference table between them. Soren greeted her with a nod, his grey eyes sharp behind his glasses, and slid a notepad closer. "So, Miss McLean, you said you had something specific in mind about the inheritance. What are we working with today?" Carolyn clasped her hands, her fingers cool against each other, and took a steadying breath. "I've thought it over," she began, her voice clear despite the weight of her words. "I want to donate most of it, the apartment, the stocks, the bulk of the savings, to the Children's Cancer Foundation Linda mentioned in her will. I'll keep the country house and a little cash to start over. That's all I need." Soren's pen paused mid-scratch, his brow furrowing slightly as he nodded. "All right. That's generous. Very generous. We can make that happen." He jotted a note, then looked up, expecting her to continue. "There's more," she said, leaning forward slightly. "The house. It's mine for now, but I want a condition attached. If David ever gets his act together, if he proves he's stepping up, taking care of his daughter, being a real father, then the house should go to him. Not right away, not without evidence. But if he changes, I want him to have it." Soren's hand stilled, the pen hovering over the page. He blinked at her, his usually composed features betraying a flicker of astonishment. In his 20-odd years of practice, he'd seen wills twisted by greed, families torn apart over silverware, but this was something else entirely. A quiet act of grace laced with a challenge, a lifeline dangled to a man who'd burned every bridge. He adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat to mask his surprise. "That's unconventional," he said carefully. "You're sure about this? It's a big if with David." "I'm sure," she replied, her gaze steady. "I don't expect miracles, but Linda always hoped he'd find his way back. This is my way of leaving the door cracked open, not for me, but for her." Soren nodded slowly, a faint respect creeping into his expression as he scribbled the conditions. They spent the next hour hunched over paperwork, the rustle of pages and the scratch of his pen filling the room. He walked her through the legal jargon, transfer deeds, contingency clauses, trustee oversight for the donation, his voice a calm anchor as she signed her name again and again. When it was done, the stack of documents sat neatly bound, a testament to her resolve. As they rose to part, Soren extended his hand. Carolyn took it, his grip firm and warm, lingering for a moment before he let go. He tilted his head, studying her with a curiosity he couldn't quite hide. "Mind if I ask one last thing?" he said, his tone softer now, less formal. "Why? Why give him that chance after everything?" Carolyn smiled, a small wistful curve of her lips, her eyes distant for a beat. "It's what Linda would have wanted," she said simply. "She loved him, flaws and all, and she believed people could change, even him. I'm not doing it for David, I'm doing it for her because she saw something in him I can't anymore. Maybe she was right, maybe not. But this way, it's on him to prove it." Soren held her gaze, then gave a slow nod, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. "She was a hell of a woman, Linda. And you're not far behind." He stepped back, gesturing to the door. "Take care, Carolyn. Call if you need anything." She nodded, slipping her coat back on, and walked out into the crisp afternoon air, the weight of the past lifting just a little more with each step. Carolyn settled into a small town Soren had mentioned offhand during their last meeting, a quiet, promising place called Willow Creek, nestled between rolling hills and a lazy river. It was a far cry from the chaos she'd left behind, with its tree-lined streets and a pace that felt like a deep breath. She rented a modest apartment on the outskirts, a cozy one-bedroom with a view of a sprawling oak tree that turned golden in the fall. Most of the inheritance money she'd kept went into a few sturdy pieces of furniture. A plush sofa in deep green, a wooden dining table with mismatched chairs, a bed with a quilt she'd sewn herself. The rest she tucked away, a cushion for the life she was building. She landed a job at the local hospital, a squat brick building with a steady hum of activity. Slipping back into her nursing scrubs felt like pulling on an old familiar skin, comforting in its routine. She worked the day shift now, a luxury after years of nights, tending to broken bones, fevers, and the occasional cranky patient with the same quiet competence she'd always had. The staff welcomed her warmly, and soon her days were filled with the clatter of charts, the beep of monitors, and the chatter of colleagues who didn't know her past. A year slipped by, soft and unhurried. The sharp edges of her grief and anger dulled, smoothed over by time and distance. She woke to birdsong instead of memories, cooked simple meals in her tiny kitchen, and let herself heal. Life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, steady, peaceful, a blank page she was learning to fill. Only on her days off did a quiet loneliness creep in, a faint ache that work couldn't quite chase away. She'd sit by her window with a cup of tea, gazing at the horizon, her mind drifting to places she'd never seen. Cobblestone streets in Europe, windswept cliffs by the sea, nostalgic for dreams she hadn't yet lived. Then, one crisp afternoon, her phone rang, the screen flashing Soren Hill's name. She answered, a flutter of unease stirring in her chest. "Soren, long time no talk. What's up?" His familiar chuckle crackled through the line. "Afternoon, Carolyn. I've got some news. Good and bad, I'm afraid. Which do you want first?" Her heart skipped, but she managed a small laugh. "Let's start with the good. Might soften the blow of the bad." "Knew you'd say that," he said, his voice warm with amusement. "All right, the good news. David's not with Shirley anymore. Seems she bolted not long after the will reading. Left him high and dry with the baby girl. Just like you figured she might. He's been raising the baby on his own, from what I hear. Doing a decent job of it, too. Got a place, a job, keeping her fed and happy." Carolyn leaned against the counter, her breath catching as she processed it. David, a father, actually stepping up. She hadn't expected that, not really. "That's good," she said softly, almost to herself. "And the house? Should we move forward with the plan?" Soren paused, then replied, "That's what I was getting to. He's meeting the condition you set, taking care of his daughter. If you're still okay with it, I can start the paperwork to transfer the country house to him." She stared out the window, the oak's branches swaying gently in the breeze. A year ago, she'd offered that lifeline for Linda's sake, not her own, a faint hope David might redeem himself. Now, picturing him with a toddler in his arms, she felt a strange mix of relief and closure. "Yeah," she said finally, her voice firm. "You're something else, Carolyn," Soren said, a note of admiration in his tone. "I'll get it sorted. Now, you ready for the bad news?" She braced herself, nodding even though he couldn't see. "Hit me." Soren's sigh crackled through the phone, a playful edge to it that made Carolyn tilt her head. "All right, the bad news," he said, his voice dipping into a mock-serious tone. "I might have to steal some of your time, if you don't mind, that is. I'm driving through Willow Creek next week for a case, and I was wondering if I could take you out for lunch or dinner. Your pick." Carolyn's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the phone. She hadn't seen that coming, not from Soren, the steady, no-nonsense lawyer who'd shepherded her through the chaos of Linda's will. Her mind blanked for a second, caught off guard by the shift from business to this. "Wait," she said, a laugh bubbling up despite herself. "That's the bad news? What's the catch?" "Well," he drawled, amusement threading through his words. "The catch is you might be late getting back to work. I've been told I'm a slow eater. Could drag lunch out a bit." She grinned, the smile tugging at her cheeks as she leaned against the kitchen counter, glad he couldn't see the flush creeping up her neck. "I think I can handle that," she said, her tone light. "Let's say lunch." "Deal," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice too. "Looking forward to it, Carolyn." A week later, she stepped out of the hospital. She stopped short when she spotted Soren waiting by the curb, leaning against his car, a sleek silver thing that looked out of place in Willow Creek's sleepy charm. In his hands was a bouquet of flowers, a burst of daisies and lavender tied with a simple ribbon. She blinked, her heart doing a little flip at the sight of him, all-tailored jacket and easy confidence, holding flowers of all things. "Soren?" she called, walking over, her scrubs rustling faintly. "What's this?" He straightened, offering the bouquet with a sheepish grin. Thought I'd start things off right. You struck me as a flowers kind of person." She took them, the petals cool against her fingers, and laughed softly. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" "Only the good kind, I hope," he said, opening the passenger door for her. "Come on, I found a spot downtown. Little diner with the best pie, or so the reviews say." Lunch was a revelation. They slid into a booth at Millie's Diner, a cosy place with checkered tablecloths and the smell of frying bacon in the air. Over burgers and crisp fries, conversation flowed like water, effortless, warm, dotted with laughter. He told her about a quirky case involving a disputed parrot inheritance. She shared a story about a patient who'd proposed to her with a candy ring. The hours slipped by, the diner's chatter fading into a pleasant hum around them. As the server cleared their plates, Soren glanced at his watch, then back at her, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "I've got about 5 hours to kill before you're off work," he said, leaning forward slightly. "How about dinner too?" "There's a place by the river I'd love to try, supposed to have a killer pasta special." Carolyn burst out laughing, the sound bright and unguarded. "What's your game plan here, Soren? 2 meals in one day?" He raised his eyebrows, feigning innocence, but a grin tugged at his lips. "Game plan?" "No plan, just observation. I find it downright bizarre that no one's scooped up a gem like you yet. Smart, kind, tougher than most people I've met, so I figured, why not take my shot while I'm in town? Carpe diem and all that." She shook her head, still smiling, warmth blooming in her chest. "You're ridiculous," she said, but there was no bite to it. "All right, dinner it is, but you're picking up the tab for both. You're the one with the fancy lawyer salary." "Done," he said, his grin widening. "I'll swing by the hospital at 6. Don't work too hard till then." She watched him go, the bouquet still cradled in her arms, and felt something shift, light and new, like the first page of a story she hadn't expected to write. Soren had a way about him, methodical, precise, like he'd been quietly orchestrating things all along. Carolyn caught herself wondering sometimes, half joking, if he'd planned it from the start, recommending Willow Creek, nudging her toward this quiet town where roots could grow deep. She'd tease him about it over coffee, and he'd just smirk, those grey eyes glinting behind his glasses, neither confirming nor denying. Whether it was fate or his subtle hand, it didn't matter much in the end. Their courtship had been a whirlwind. Lunch turned to dinner, turned to a proposal under the oak tree outside her apartment, the ring simple but steady, like him. They married within the year, a small ceremony by the river with wildflowers in her hair and his vows making her laugh through tears. 5 years later, their life had settled into a rhythm she'd never dared dream of. Their daughter Emily was 2 now, a whirlwind of curls and giggles, her hazel eyes a mix of Carolyn's green and Soren's grey. The country house, Linda's house now theirs, stood proud on its hill, its porch swing still creaking, its walls filled with new memories. Carolyn worked part-time at the hospital, Soren handled cases from a home office littered with legal pads, and Emily ruled them both with sticky hands and a fearless grin. That weekend, the air buzzed with summer warmth as they prepped the backyard for Emily's 2nd birthday. The grill smoked with burgers and hot dogs, a playlist of old rock tunes crackled from a speaker, and laughter drifted from friends and neighbours milling about. Carolyn wrestled a stack of paper plates onto a table draped in a bright yellow cloth, while Soren chased Emily through the grass, her squeals piercing the air as he scooped her up. Balloons bobbed on strings tied to chairs, and the scent of sunscreen mingled with the promise of cake. A low rumble broke the rhythm. A truck rolling up the gravel drive out front. Carolyn brushed her hands on her shorts, curious, and headed toward the house, her flip-flops slapping against the porch steps. The doorbell chimed just as she reached it, and when she swung the door open, her breath caught in her throat. David stood there, older now, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his shoulders broader but less tense. Beside him, a little girl with Shirley's blonde curls clung to his leg, then leapt into his arms as he bent to lift her. He held a white bakery box in his other hand, and when he looked up, His smile was tentative but real. "Hey, Carolyn," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "This is Lily. My daughter." She blinked, shock rooting her in place for a beat before she found her voice. "David." "Hi." "And Lily." "Wow. Hello there." She managed to smile, her heart thudding with a mix of surprise and something softer she couldn't name. David shifted Lily in his arms, the girl peering at Carolyn with wide, curious eyes. "We were just passing through," he said, "and I wanted to stop by. To thank you. For everything. Not just for taking care of Mom all those years, but for me too, somehow. The house giving me that chance, it changed things. I've been trying to do right by her." He nodded at Lily, his gaze steady. "By both of them." Carolyn's throat tightened, Linda's memory flickering between them like a shared light. "I'm glad," she said quietly, meaning it. "You look good, David. Settled." He nodded, a faint flush creeping up his neck. Getting there. "Anyway, I didn't want to intrude, just brought this." He handed her the box, the faint scent of vanilla wafting up as she took it. "A cake. For the party. Figured it's the least I could do. Thank you, Carolyn. One more time." "You don't have to go," she said, stepping back. "It's Emily's birthday. Join us. There's plenty of food and Lily might like the bounce house." He hesitated, glancing at Lily, then shook his head with a small smile. "Appreciate it, but we've got to drive ahead. Don't want to shake things up for anyone. Just wanted you to have this." He ruffled Lily's hair, then turned, guiding her back to the truck with a gentle hand. Carolyn watched them go, the engine rumbling to life as they pulled away, a strange peace settling over her. She carried the cake to the backyard, the box cool against her palms, and set it on the table beside a tower of cupcakes already half demolished by sticky-fingered kids. Soren sidled up, Emily perched on his hip, her face smeared with ketchup. "Who was that?" he asked, eyebrow arched. "David," she said simply, brushing a curl from Emily's forehead. "Brought a cake. Said thanks." Soren's gaze lingered on her, reading the quiet shift in her expression, then nodded. "Hell of a guy to show up now," he quipped, but his tone was light, no judgment in it. "Yeah," she murmured, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Hell of a guy." The party spun on, kids shrieking in the bounce house, friends clinking beers, Emily blowing out her candles with a gleeful puff that sent wax dripping onto the frosting. Carolyn leaned against Soren, his arm warm around her shoulders, and watched their daughter toddle through the chaos, her laughter a bright thread weaving through the day. The past was there, in the cake on the table, in the echoes of Linda's faith. But it didn't weigh her down anymore. She'd built something new, something hers, and as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold, she felt the circle close, soft and sure.